is Professor Mark Navin from Oakland University joining us on the MegaCast. Mark, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on today. I'm glad to be here.
Glad to have you. How are you? How's your family, your colleagues?
I'm doing okay. We're staying healthy and safe and indoors, and we all need haircuts, but otherwise things are going pretty well.
Yeah, we do need haircuts. Thank you for making that point. I'm looking at myself in my viewfinder here, and man, my hair is longer than it's been in the last 3-4 years. We do need it. But
so I can't see you in this interview,
no,
so if there's a way to share your video,
there
that'd
is.
be great.
We don't have video on our end to send over there, but you'll be able to see in the replays and on the Facebook Live page of Oakland University shortly after today's program. Before we get
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, before we get too far into the nitty-gritty, from your knowledge regarding the vaccine and the production of the vaccine, can you explain the process of executing a successful and safe vaccine from your knowledge?
So I'm not an immunologist. So I work in ethics in healthcare and ethics in public health. And so I'm happy to speak to some of the values involved in the production and widespread distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine. So you might know, right, there are dozens of teams working on developing vaccine right now. Almost all of them are in the early research or the preclinical stages. There's just a handful that have actually gone to testing. So phase 1 testing, as you know, is you test a very small number of people to see if the drug, or in this case, the vaccine, is toxic, if it's dangerous to people. And so there are like 5 teams, I think, at that stage. And there's a few teams that have moved on to phase 2 that you get, a small group of people and you test effectiveness at various dosages and also short-term effects. We don't have any of the researchers yet at phase 3, which is where you go to a large-scale group over a longer period of time, and you get sort of statistically significant results about the sort of levels of effectiveness of this new product, and then also you get to see the longer-term side effects and consequences. So no one's at phase 3 yet, though I imagine in the next months. By the end of the year, there'll be a number of these groups that are into past phase 2 into phase 3.
Mark Navin with us on the MegaCast on Civic Center TV, Birmingham Area Municipal Access Television, 89.3 Lakes FM, 88.1 WBFH, the BIF, WAHS, 89.5 Avondale Community Radio, and on the Facebook page of Oakland University via Facebook Live. Mark Navin, Bioethics, Social and Political Philosophy, Public Health Law, and Policy Professor at Oakland University. So everybody's awaiting this vaccine. This is what brings us to the point where we can begin more expedient reopening of the economy, of our society, and return to normal. All that being considered from a bioethical standpoint, from a political standpoint, what are the dangers in moving too fast in creating and distributing this vaccine?
Well, so let's talk again about the relevant values. So hope is a value. And I think, we get out of bed in the morning, a lot of us, because we have hope. And as your previous guest said, we have optimism. And so optimism is a good thing. It's a virtue, and we ought to be hopeful. But hope by itself is not a plan. And in fact, without good evidence and planning, it's just magical thinking. And so I worry sometimes that we're maybe not doing the kind of difficult planning and decision-making we need to do now, because there is some magical thinking going on that either the virus is going to go away on its own, which of course would be great. I'm happy for miracles if they happen. And also I think there's some magical thinking and excessive, unjustified optimism about the vaccine. We're seeing, especially the last couple of weeks, some skepticism about whether or not we'll even ever have a vaccine for this disease. And in fact, again, I'm not an immunologist, but the fact that we've seen some people who've recovered from this disease, but then are getting it again, shows that natural immunity doesn't seem to last very long. It's very preliminary evidence, and I'd be glad to be wrong about this. But I think there's good reason for skepticism that it may be a long time before we have a vaccine, or we may not have a vaccine at all. So one value to think about is the kind of optimism we're engaging in, the kind of hope that we're having, and making sure that that's propelling us towards constructive problem solving and not magical thinking.
And there's a dilemma there. There's a dilemma in the process and the speed of developing a vaccine. There's a dilemma in the process of providing hope to the public in terms of speed. You go too fast, and it's an unsafe vaccine, and you don't foresee those problems coming up. You cause another public health crisis. You go too slowly, more people die. Same thing with the optimism angle as well. If you give too much optimism that the vaccine is the end-all be-all, once we have a vaccine, we're in the clear, and that's not the case, and the virus mutates, or it doesn't provide full immunity, or the vaccine doesn't provide full immunity, you're giving false hope that can, frankly, be dangerous. How do we find balance from an ethical standpoint in that?
I mean, so one way to find balance, here's the more general point for maybe everything I'm about to say, or I'm going to say until you're done with me, which is there's no direct line from the science to the policy. Right? So sometimes people say that, we should have the scientists and the epidemiologists in charge. And that's just silly, because if health were the only value that we had, then of course doctors and epidemiologists should be in charge. But health is not the only value. There are lots of things we care about. Right? We care about kids being in school. We care about public trust. We care about being able to meet our friends and in small and large groups. We care about so many things: economic growth, poverty, funding our schools, as we said in the previous interview. And we disagree in our communities about whether all these things are values, and in particular, how to prioritize them. This is what marks differences between Democrats and Republicans. Not that we maybe have different values, but we think about ranking them in different ways. And in a society where you disagree about values, the way you resolve that is through politics and through debate and through deliberation. So I would actually, that the first thing I would say, the fundamental thing I would say, is that we should reject appeals to the sort of high priesthood of science, as if there's a direct line from getting the facts correct to getting the policy right. There are quite deep-seated value disagreements that we have nationwide and in our own state, and that facing those head on is not a failure, but that's actually appropriate. It's an honest way of acknowledging conflicts that exist, and it is the justified way of responding to those conflicts to do so through democratic politics.
So politically, socially, ethically, as we're currently trying to bridge those gaps between one side's values, another side's values, the values of those maybe in the middle, how are we doing right now in terms of that? Are we going about that properly? Are we going about that in a way that's unproductive, maybe?
Well, so one general point is that we can make better progress when the core values or the essential values are widely shared. And so one thing that worries me a great deal is that some of the values around public health and some of the sort of practices that we ought to care about when we're making rational plans towards a future that aren't relying on magical thinking about vaccines development, for example, some of these we're seeing increased political polarization, and not necessarily just polarization, but we're seeing increased association of some of these values and behaviors with political identities. Because what people really value, more than they value any sort of list of claims like liberty or equality or justice or solidarity, what they really care about is being like the people like them and protecting their tribe and their group. And we do a lot better when the tribe and group we care about is the people of Michigan or the people of America than when we think about it being a Trump or an anti-Trump tribalism. And so I think there's deep reason for concern, for example, that mask wearing as a practice that demonstrates concern for vulnerable members of our community, that has become a politicized practice. But on the flip side, I would say it's troubling to me the degree to which many people on the left have given unthinking affirmation to quite significant restrictions on their own liberty. That whether they're constitutional or not, I'm not in a position to determine that. Maybe the next guest, Professor Giulio, will speak to that. But they certainly rely on contested claims about the central political values.
So bridging that gap between what we politically value and what we generally value in terms of tribalism, as you spoke, we want to protect our own, we want to protect our families, we want to protect our colleagues, we want to protect the state of Michigan before anything else, so to speak. What's the best way we can go about bridging those gaps?
So I think, the right answer is to ask where you're speaking from. And so, look, if I could radically remake our nation's media landscape in some ways, I would, right? But that's not the question. So I had a good answer and I lost it. Can you rephrase the question for me? So
we have this gap between how we politically align and our political values, right, and what our personal values are, what our tribalistic values are necessarily. We want to protect our own at home, and we want to protect those closest to us and close to that, and so on and so forth before we go broadly. What are the dangers in that? How do we bridge that gap?
Yes, let me speak to this in this way. So I think it's helpful to distinguish between problems that are problems of politics and problems that are problems of ethics. And so put this maybe another way. And the central problem of politics is keeping the people safe. And this is why most people are pretty happy to have a police force and to have a military. And so likewise, public health is one of the central activities of politics. And so we do well when we try and keep our police and our military and our public health activities as politically neutral as possible. Obviously, they're political institutions, but it's important to have strong bipartisan support for those because they're speaking to such a central political goal that we all care about. However, because that goal is so valuable, there's a temptation for people on various sides of political debates to try and grab it as their own. So you often see people on the right, for example, trying to own national defense as their issue. National defense is one of the core purposes of the state. And if one party owns it, then one party has a kind of special claim to make. I think you see correspondingly on the left right now, people trying to own public health as an issue of the left, and doing so in ways that maybe push public health beyond its appropriate limits. So for example, I would say that the proper goal of public health is public safety, is preventing sort of breakdown in peaceful social cooperation that's made possible when we're generally healthy. The goal of public health is not to fix parents who make bad decisions for their kids, for example, right? So for example, when it comes to vaccine mandates, it's a related issue, but I think one that's centrally relevant to the current outbreak. When it comes to laws that make parents vaccinate, we ought to focus that the reason for those laws is to keep the community safe, not necessarily to protect individual children from their parents' bad choices. And I think we make a mistake when we move from the very reasonable goal of the state, which is public health, to thinking that we ought to be micromanaging choices of individuals, especially intruding into the family.
Mark Navin, professor of bioethics, social and political philosophy, public health law, and policy at Oakland University, with us on the MegaCast today on our family of stations and on the Facebook Live of Oakland University as well. So moving forward, as the vaccine is developed, it's being worked on in America. It's being worked on all throughout the world. It's not just an American vaccine or a Chinese vaccine or a European vaccine, British vaccine, French vaccine, whatever it may be, wherever it may be found. And I saw a video recently, a clip that was really interesting to me. Mark Cuban brought up an interesting scenario on a cable news network in regards to who makes the vaccine first. So is it if the U.S. makes the vaccine first, if China does, if another nation does, and then who is it shared with when? Also came up as a potential issue. So when a vaccine is found effective and the vaccine, so to speak, is made, who gets it first? How, from the standpoint of bioethics, should that be determined? Because it's got to be spread throughout the world, not just the place where it's found.
So it's an outstanding question and one that I don't have a good answer to, but here's part of the problem. I think we should rightfully think about vaccine development against for diseases that are especially threatening to public health as within the purview of the state, as a sort of necessary activity for our governments to be doing. But of course, in the real world, vaccines are developed by private corporations, often with some federal or other government monies, but these are either solely the activity of private corporations or are partnerships between private corporations, as I said, with public monies. And as you indicate, there's at least a couple dozen teams developing vaccines in various stages. I highly recommend the Regulatory Focus website that has a COVID-19 vaccine tracker. It's updated daily, at least in my experience, and really informative on who these teams are and what their funding is and what their goals are and even their methods. So one point is I don't actually think we have the kind of control that you're over vaccine distribution that your question is presupposing. And I think we've seen some of these tensions in the context of the personal protective equipment distribution issues that came out earlier in the outbreak, when we saw the federal government intervening with shipments from third-party private corporations to other parts of sort of state and local government in America, but also intervening with shipments from those corporations that were going to other countries. And so there's some deep questions, I think, about who has the ultimate responsibility for making these distribution decisions and what the role of the free market should be, especially when the distribution decisions are so consequential for life and for political stability and economic life.
It does. It creates a whole different dilemma morally and ethically for us worldwide, and not just in the U.S., because it's a worldwide issue. This is not an epidemic. It's a pandemic. Every country in the world is working through this and has different issues that are stemming from COVID-19, and just we have to figure out some sort of balance, not only on our own land, but on the lands throughout the world in order to protect the general public. So just before we have a couple more minutes with you, Professor Mark Navin from Oakland University, currently in Michigan, definitely across the country, we see far more political polarization, or we're experiencing far more political polarization now than ever before. We're facing a political and a public health crisis. In this new normal, how do we best move forward from a social and political standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint in this case, as we address these serious issues and other issues in the immediate and distant future?
So I think whenever possible, we should avoid thinking of politics as war. We should avoid thinking of politics as a game that is won by those who have the most power or the most votes, especially when we're talking about centrally important activities of the state, like protecting the public health. And so, for example, when we think about a world, one I hope that comes soon, in which we have wide distribution of COVID vaccine, we're going to be asked to think about the kinds of laws that regulate the use of that vaccine. So people have talked about immunization passports that would prohibit travel or employment or education or other opportunities to participate in our shared life, prohibit access to those goods to people who aren't vaccinated. And I think we need to be very careful when we start thinking about using state power in coercive ways, even to promote public good. And so here's another way to put it. Even if ethically something is the right thing to do, even if you have the true ethical theory, that doesn't answer the political question, because the political question, politics is fundamentally about having to get peace and stability and trust. And frankly, peace and stability and trust is a pretty rare thing in the history of humanity. And we've got a bunch of it. It's not perfect. Things have gotten a little worse, but we still got something really good. And so the number one priority should be not to mess up what we've got, right? You want the people with camouflage and long guns outside the Michigan Capitol to be very few in number and to be fringe people. But when you start bringing the power of the state down more and more on people, even if from an ethical point of view you're justified, you're going to politicize an issue, especially in a country that a lot of people think about liberty much more expansively than public health people tend to. You are going to do some very detrimental things to our politics in the name of public health, and we can avoid making those mistakes.
Professor Mark Navin from Oakland University, just another moment with you before we got to let you go. Any words of advice on that note for the public, for our leadership as we continue through this process and address these issues, and even beyond this crisis, when life goes on and we still have other issues to face in the future?
I think it's always a good idea to assume that your opponents in politics are people of goodwill, and it's always a bad idea to tar all of your opponents or people you disagree with the image of the ideological fringe. So I know a number of people who think that maybe Governor Whitmer in Michigan went a little too far or has gone a little too long in some of the stay-at-home orders. Those people are not the crazies with camouflage and guns outside the State House. And likewise, I know people that have been sort of critical of some of the public health establishment, but that doesn't make the public health establishment into Nazis. There are people, the core of this country and of this community, and you see this in polls, 70, 80% of people in Michigan supportive of social distancing and of some reasonable measures for protecting our community. We are reasonable people of goodwill. We have some different beliefs. We have some different values. And if we can focus on that being a core of reasonable people that can deliberate together, and we can avoid demonizing each other, we can avoid further polarization, and we can actually commit ourselves to the common good that we all recognize.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today. Professor Mark Navin, Professor of Bioethics, Social and Political Philosophy, Public Health Law, and Policy at Oakland University. Thank you for joining us on the MegaCast.
Happy to join you. Take care.